Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Iowa Ideas In-Depth Week. This week's focus is on drinking water, and the name of today's session is Iowa's Nutrient Reduction Strategy Turns 10. For those who don't know me, my name is Brittany Miller, and I'm the Energy and Environment Reporter at the Gazette, and also co-lead of the Iowa Ideas Energy and Environment Track. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest, and our In-Depth Week sponsor, LaRue Law Office, for their support. We're going to try to watch a quick video from the LaRue Law Office. We've been having a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're going to see if it plays.
Hello, I'm Jim LaRue of LaRue Law Office. I'm pleased to be your In-Depth Week sponsor for this week's critical conversations on drinking water in Iowa. Iowa's abundant fresh water supplies, once upon a time, were among our state's most important and precious natural resources. Now, that prized Iowa resource is at grave risk. Iowans are faced with a huge and unprecedented water pollution challenge. Fortunately, when facing large challenges, over the years, Iowans have often worked together to make things better. By improving our freshwater resources in the future, Iowans will reclaim an important part of our natural heritage. It's the Iowa way of doing things. Let's get going.
Sweet. Thank you to the LaRue Law Office again for their sponsorship. Now I want to introduce the expert panelists here for today's discussion. Actually, I'm going to have them introduce themselves. From order on my screen, let's do Neil, Jamie, and Alicia.
Hi, I'm Neil Hamilton, a emeritus professor of law at Drake University, where I ran the Agricultural Law Center. I'm also a County Soil and Water Conservation District Commissioner in Dallas County.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Benning. I'm the Assistant Director for Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension at Iowa State University. My role is working with our field specialists, faculty, and staff on agriculture and natural resources programming, providing educational opportunities throughout the state of Iowa. Prior to this role, I was the water quality program manager, so I've had a lot of experience and time spent with nutrient reduction strategy related efforts, and now still stay very involved in those efforts as well.
And I'm Alicia Basto. I'm the Water Program Director at the Iowa Environmental Council. I've been with the council for a little over 4 years now. We are a nonprofit organization. We work on law and policy related to Iowa's water, land, energy, and climate.
Sweet. Thank you all again for being here today. Really lucky to have you. As you all know, we're going to be chatting about the nutrient reduction strategy. The final version was released in May 2013, a decade ago. And in this discussion, we'll talk about what's in the strategy, what isn't, its progress, its shortfalls, and its future. I'll be reserving the end of the call for any audience questions, so please feel free to pop those in the chat throughout the session. So to kick this off, let's start with talking about the history of the strategy. Why was it created, and who had a say in how it was created?
Well, I'll step
first,
forward.
Neil. Yeah.
It was created in large part because the EPA required the state to create it. It was designed to deal with the hypoxia zone in the Gulf, and EPA had all the states and the Mississippi, upper Mississippi watershed develop nutrient reduction strategies based in part on their contributions to the pollution that's going down through the Mississippi. And so that was in large part the driver behind it. EPA really required the state to do something.
And Neil, can you define what the hypoxia zone is for those who don't know about it?
Sure. The hypoxia zone is that area of the Gulf that varies every year, but it's where it's oxygen deficient because the amount of nutrients coming down the river and the fresh water that are flushed into the Gulf and the algae blooms that are related to it absorb the oxygen. And so it's otherwise known as the dead zone. That's in part, I think, how people would recognize it. And it's a fairly significant area. It can be as much as 600 or 6,000 square miles.
Iowa State played a role in developing the science assessment portion of the strategy. So once the message came from EPA that states should come together and develop these strategies, Iowa State University partnered with the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship and the Department of Natural Resources and reviewed the science for a lot of different reasons to establish at that point how much nitrogen and phosphorus was leaving the state, and then assessing the practices that could address the nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So if applied in the field or at the edge of a field or making landscape changes, what kind of effect would that have? And that was the role that Iowa State played. They also looked at different scenarios so that we could communicate to farmers and to stakeholders, what is this going to take? What does it mean to meet the nutrient reduction goal of 45% for the state of Iowa? And what combination of practices and to what level of adoption do we need to hit that goal?
Yeah, and I'll add that the hypoxia zone was first identified as early as the 70s. Hypoxic zones started popping up across all over the globe really after the Green Revolution and fertilizers were starting to be heavily used. So this is a problem that has been people have known about for decades, and the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force started up in the 90s to try to address the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy is a response to that task force asking for the states to prepare their own state level plans. And ours contains the science assessment, which Jamie mentioned, and then also a policy portion, which says that basically how the strategy is going to be implemented. Initially, I think that the first goal for reductions was, correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, but I think it was 2015. There were supposed to be 20% reduction, but then that was moved back to 2025. And now the goal is for a 45% reduction by 2035. Those are kind of the bigger picture goals of the overall task force.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into kind of delving more into what's exactly in this strategy. We know it addresses, point source pollution and non-point source pollution. Can you explain what point and non-point source pollution is for people who don't know, and then the different strategies that the nutrient reduction strategy has for kind of combating them?
From a legal standpoint, the distinction comes out of the Clean Water Act, and the point source is fairly simple for people to understand. It would be like the outfall pipe that would be coming out of a water treatment plant or a factory. And point sources were not necessarily easy to address, but they were certainly addressable, right? In that you could identify them. At the same time, in the Clean Water Act, they included what was called non-point source pollution, which is more the diffuse pollution that might come off of a field. It's a non-scientific standard, though, from a legal standpoint. And in many ways, it was a way for the writers of the Clean Water Act to essentially exempt agriculture from at least consideration under the early parts of the Clean Water Act. And we're still left with it today, but it's a significant distinction because of how it plays into something like the nutrient reduction strategy.
So in the strategy on the non-point source side, we are addressing nitrogen, or in the form of nitrate, and phosphorus. Phosphorus moves primarily with soil. So the phosphorus is attached to soil particles and moves with soil erosion for the most part. And then nitrate moves with water. It's a very highly soluble nutrient and moves either through the soil into tile drainage, if the field is a tile drained field, or just through lateral flow through well-drained soil, sandier soils, where that drainage happens more naturally without the need for tile drainage. So you can see that we can't, in the non-point, things like soil erosion, they're happening all over the state. That movement of nitrate is happening throughout different points of fields. So that's why it's called non-point source. We can't define one point where that nutrient is leaving the field.
And for the point sources in the strategy, there were some requirements made of them. Point sources are regulated dischargers of pollution to our waterways. And so the nutrient reduction strategy required some upgrades to some of their, especially the wastewater and drinking water systems, upgrades of their technologies to be able to reduce the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that they were discharging back into the water. So the science assessment of the nutrient reduction strategy says that 92% of the state's nitrogen load is coming from non-point sources, 8% is coming from point sources, and for phosphorus, 80% is coming from non-point sources and 20% is coming from non-point sources or for point sources. So we're regulating, the point source side of the equation, which is where the smaller portion of nutrient pollution is actually coming from.
It's important to recognize, though, that the distinction can be a little confusing because there's certainly a number of sources of pollution coming from agriculture that can really be identifiable to points. And tile outlets are being a good example. The nozzles on a spray rig, the knives on a fertilizer applicator, a manure, a honey wagon. And so, it's soil erosion may well be diffuse, but a number of other significant sources of what are potential polluters, in fact, can be identified and could be controlled if we were more serious about it.
Yeah, I wanted to, ask a little bit more about, the voluntary side for the non-point source pollution. First, I wanted to ask you all about your thoughts on that, because I know that's kind of a hot topic that's gotten some flack over the years. Neil, you chuckled, so let's start with you.
Well, I don't want to color the conversation, but I've said in any number of times over the years that the nutrient reduction strategy is largely an exercise in magical thinking. And that's in part because, at least as relates to agriculture, it's built on top of this voluntary only, no role for regulations mantra, which is actually incorporated into it. And as a result, all right, if you ask the question, what's it require anyone to do? The answer is it doesn't require anyone to do anything. And it's entirely voluntary. And as a result, a lot of people have chosen not to do anything. And that's what makes the issue of whether or not we can, quote, successfully implement it, assuming there was a strategy involved in it in terms of priorities and goals and, ideas of how to spend the money we have. But so that's at least from my perspective. And, there are a few other activities in society that are exempted entirely from regulation or from society establishing expected standards of conduct. And I think the nutrient reduction strategy will continue to suffer as long as that is the foundation of it.
Yeah, we've, our organization, in the forming of the nutrient reduction strategy and since it's been adopted formally by the state, has been critical of the voluntary nature of the non-point source side of things, because we know that that's where the most pollution is coming from. But there's really no way to actually enforce the strategy or to make it really, pardon the pun, but hold any water. And so, without that and without a really strong regulatory system in place, we're not going to see the adoption of the conservation practices at the scale and scope that is necessary to address this problem, especially at the rate by which we're trying to see these reductions. You know, we're supposed to be seeing 20% reduction in 2 years. And, you know, we're not anywhere close to that on the nitrogen side of things. So, you know, if we actually want to address this problem, then we need to take a serious look at how are we, what are we asking, and is it reasonable to ask, you know, farmers to be voluntarily adopting these things when, you know, all of the economic pressures are against that. And I think, you know, if we're serious about addressing the problem as a state, we need to come together and say, okay, this is something that we value and we want to put effort and strength behind and have draw a line in the sand.
Yeah, Jamie, I'm hoping you can speak on, you know, ISU's role in, you know, obviously helping create the strategy and why, you know, the non-point source pollution was made, you know, voluntary, the kind of history behind that. And then I know you had some like data points that you could bring out about the progress, because ISU is also in charge of, you know, monitoring and tracking. So, yeah.
Sure. So our role as Iowa State University is both to support the science and developing the science assessment, as I described, and then providing education and outreach. So working within the framework that we have, which is currently voluntary, sharing the information out, helping stakeholders, farmers, landowners, ag professionals understand the strategy, what it means, what we're asking of folks. And then we do have a role also in measuring. So we employ the measurement coordinator. It is a project that is done in coordination with the Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship and the Department of Natural Resources. But our role there is to gather data each year related to the different portions of the strategy. So we need to monitor the number of dollars and people invested in focusing on strategy efforts. We have different surveys going on and education happening. So we consider that the human element that we're measuring. So changes in behavior and action toward the strategy. The third part that we measure is land. So that gets to the practices, what's happening on the ground, number of acres of cover crops, number of bioreactors, changes on the point source assessments done with those cities and industries. And then finally, water. So it's looking at both measured water quality through monitoring and also modeled water quality. So taking the changes year after year, the net change in practices or land use changes, and modeling those efforts to come up with an estimate of load reduction or load change based on what happened that year. So in past years, we have had an annual report. So we would summarize this, publish a 100 plus or minus page report, did that for many years. In 2019, 2020, we published the first dashboard. So we went to more of a digital format. And in that time, we also transitioned to a new measurement coordinator. So we have not yet published the other three parts of the dashboard. That was the first land dashboard. So we need to do an inputs, human and water dashboard. So we are behind on that, or we'd like to be farther along. But what we can say about changes that have happened relative to the strategy is that practice implementation has increased, and there's been a lot of education, a lot of increase in funding dedicated toward this to support the people on the landscape to make these changes. We have seen an improvement in phosphorus. We're getting close to the phosphorus reduction goal, but we are not close to the nitrogen reduction goal. So fairly stable, or have gone a little bit backwards on the nitrogen reduction goal because of land use changes. So shifting of land from CRP or perennials, some longer term rotations to more acres of corn and soybeans or continuous corn. And that really has a large impact on nitrogen loss.
You know, Brittany, if I can, I'd like to speak to a little bit of the history again, of the strategy. I was teaching a class called environmental regulation for the last 25 years, and also our legislation class, and doing that as the strategy was being developed. And I think it's fair to say, certainly from Iowa State's standpoint, that the strategy is long on science, right? Some wonderful science went into developing the scenarios, and these scenarios identify the various combination of practices and the price tags. And, at the time when all this was coming out, 2010, 11, 12, lots of attention to that. As to the policy side, the strategy is very thin when it comes to policy. And in fact, the history of the policy was relatively politically controversial. The DNR water quality staff didn't play a large role in writing the policy. Many parts of it came directly from comments submitted by the Iowa Farm Bureau and others. And so as a result, you had this heavy reliance on volunteerism. And then, once it was validated, right, in the sense that the scenario said, okay, this is what it would cost and that we can get there, in many ways, the scenarios have disappeared. And the strategy doesn't appear to be on prioritizing what the scenarios identified and why it is they could be implemented and when. And in fact, the strategy had a somewhat unusual kind of legal status, even if you can call it that, because it didn't have any legal status until 2018 when it was incorporated into Iowa law. Prior to that, it was a quote strategy that existed and had been agreed to by IDALS and Iowa State and the DNR, but yet wasn't actually part of the law. And so it's relatively recent as to how it's incorporated into Iowa law. And but still, it was based on that, I think, rather asymmetrical history of the science versus the policy. And that's what I think it makes Jamie's job and Iowa State's job difficult. I mean, that's partly why I think they went away from having an annual report, because it became difficult to have an annual report where you couldn't really report a whole lot of progress if you were looking at water quality and the nitrogen issue being a primary one.
Yeah, it's at the pace that we've implemented practices thus far, it is very challenging to measure that change. There's a lag time, and the practices needed to make change in terms of nitrate reduction. They've been pretty diffuse, in terms of where they're placed in the state. So we do know they're effective at the field edge. Monitoring has been done at the smaller watershed scale, where we know a basin will feed into a CREP wetland, for example, a nutrient removal wetland. But getting out into that larger scale, larger watersheds, it becomes more difficult to measure those changes when the level of adoption is lower than we'd like to see.
Jamie, I had a question about something you said a little bit ago about like that land use shift that's contributing
Sure.
to the nitrate pollution. Like, why are we seeing that shift, and why does it disproportionately affect nitrate but not like phosphorus?
So it does affect both. I think why we didn't see quite the impact on phosphorus is other soil conservation practices were in place on that cropland. So no-till on some of those corn soybean acres, terraces, practices that reduce phosphorus loss but don't have an impact on nitrate loss. So the factors at play in looking at a perennial system versus a row crop system is that there are living roots in the ground all year round in a perennial system. So CRP, a hayfield, longer term rotation, but that is not the case for a corn and soybean field. We're not seeing a greening up and an emergence of those crops until May, June, when they're starting to really actively take up nitrogen in the system. And then, close to harvest, they're not taking it up anymore. The crop has matured. So there's those edges of the growing season for a corn and soybean rotation, that early spring and late fall, when we have a lot of vulnerability to loss of nitrate. So when we convert or see a net shift from perennials to row crops, that has a large impact on nitrate loss overall in the state.
I think it's important also to recognize that, we may be making one step forward on the front 40, but 2 steps backwards on the back 40, because there are any number of other practices and changes that are happening on the land that may well override the impacts of what we're doing. And installing tiling is a good example. I'm here today in Cedar Rapids at a seminar concerning the Cedar River watershed. And the information we heard this morning indicates that in the middle Cedar, there's probably at least 1,200 miles of new tile that are being installed every year. And the installation of tile drainage is one of those conduits of nitrites to the water system. And so, right, there are any number of things that are still happening on the land that aren't necessarily conducive to improving water quality, but may in fact be taking us the other direction.
Yeah, and those net changes from a land use and practice perspective are evaluated in the measurement project. So we look at, yes, we may have increased significantly in number of acres of cover crops, but it may be negated that year by a shift in land use change, a move to row crops from perennials, hay, CRP, longer term rotations, practices like that.
Well, I would add to that to say that, there's a lot of celebration across the state when we see conservation practices installed. And, there are a lot of pats on the back all around for those kinds of things. And they are, good efforts to see these partnerships and farmers actually adopting these conservation practices. But those other, that other side of the ledger does not get as much attention in terms of, just saying, okay, yes, it's a success that we're installing these other practices, but we're also going backwards because we're installing more tile drainage or converting more land into row crop. So I think just like the context of it is really important, and that's something that is hard to communicate to the public, especially as the reporting has kind of lagged, especially on the water quality data piece. I think, the land pieces have been updated more regularly, but we haven't gotten much water quality data recently to say, it has been 10 years now that the strategy has been in place. Are we seeing reductions in any of the priority watersheds? Are we monitoring in the correct way to be able to see the impacts of the practices that we have actually installed? I think that there's a lot of improvements that could be made in the ways that the state is tracking progress on the strategy and the ways that they're reporting that to the public.
I think that one of the things to recognize, at least from my perspective, is that I don't want to say the nutrient reduction strategy is a distraction, because clearly it's our major water quality initiative. But people shouldn't be confused that it's somehow a clean water for Iowa plan, right? It was developed largely to deal with the hypoxia zone, our contributions to what's going into the Missouri and the Mississippi. We could say it's implemented tomorrow, and I'm not sure any of us would be able to go stand next to the river and notice a difference, right? That we could say that, oh my gosh, those nitrates look like they're down by 42%, right? And instead, right, it doesn't deal with how's the water in your watershed, or how's the water in the stream going through your town, or what's coming out of your tile outlets. And in fact, there's a lot of things that we know how to do. And that can in fact improve water quality and can have a significant localized impact. And in fact, if we, I believe, spent a little bit more time kind of trying to prioritize our resources and our efforts, we'd probably have more identifiable impacts. And providing the staff, for example, that are needed in the watershed management authorities around the state, that develop local plans and work with local landowners to implement the type of practices that Iowa State and Jamie and IDOLS are pursuing. But yet half the watershed management authorities in the state are either lost or going to be losing their watershed coordinators because of a shortage of funding. And so I think the issue is that could we be using the limited dollars we have a little bit to more wisely and to focusing on priorities and thinking about how it is that we could deliver clean water to Iowa citizens. And in the boot, I think, would also be helping clean up what in fact would be leaving the states and being exported into the river.
I'd like,
Sorry, Jamie, I'll let
it's
you.
okay. Yeah.
There's one audience question that I think I'll ask right now because they asked if we could distinguish between nitrates and nitrites. I think that would just help aid understanding for people who don't know. So Jamie, if you want to
Sure.
take that and then you can go
Sure.
ahead with the answer.
Yeah, so nitrate is the form of nitrogen that we see and that we measure because it's the one that's most prevalent in soluble in the system. Nitrites quickly convert to nitrates. So it is what we are concentrating on in terms of what's in our agricultural systems.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, now go ahead with what you were going to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a few of Neil's comments, that yes, the strategy was put together for addressing Gulf hypoxia, but I think it can, for nitrogen and phosphorus, we can't ask it to be more because we don't have information about bacteria and other impairments, of concern in the state. But meeting the nutrient reduction strategy goals will have an impact locally in the state. And I think that has been a rallying point for some watersheds. They took it as a challenge, and we see pockets around the state where cover crops have been strongly adopted because of that conservation ethic and water quality ethic that farmers in certain areas of the state have. I think of around Washington County, in Northeast Iowa, and Mitchell and Howard counties. There's some strong efforts. Another key point that Neil made was that we need to invest in people. So WMAs having watershed coordinators, absolutely. Senate File 512, new funding that was dedicated toward the strategy efforts and water quality efforts has helped to support permanent watershed coordinators in many of the priority watersheds that were identified in the strategy. So to give folks a little history on a watershed coordinator and their role, typically they are grant funded positions. So a watershed project or a soil and water conservation district will apply for funds and be able to fund a person for 2 or 3 years to make progress toward water quality. And that's tough, to know that you're only funded for 2 years. You can imagine folks are always kind of keeping an eye out for a different job that's more permanent to help support their family. So I think adding that Senate File 512 dollars having those grow over the years since that was approved, and investing in watershed coordinators more long-term, we have seen a lot of improvement because those coordinators can then have confidence that they'll stay in that watershed. They build relationships and trust with farmers and landowners, which is a really, essential part of making this happen, is building that trust, whether it's regulated or not. There needs to be that process of working with farmers, implementing these practices, sharing information about them and getting them on the ground. So that will have to happen no matter what the framework is.
Another audience question that I think would be useful to throw out right now for clarity, they asked, is IDALS the major agency for the nutrient reduction strategy? Please explain the difference between DNR and IDALS. So if anyone wants to take that one.
Yeah, I can explain that. So the Department of Natural Resources is the agency that's primarily responsible for the point source portion of the nutrient reduction strategy. So because the DNR has regulatory authority under the Clean Water Act, they can regulate the point sources that are discharging to waters of the U.S. So there are permits and requirements that those point sources need to reach in order to be compliant with the Clean Water Act. For the non-point source portion of the strategy, IDALS, the Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, is primarily responsible. And So they have been working on implementing those pieces of the strategy to try to build partnerships and get conservation practices installed to address the non-point portion of it. And because there's no regulatory, avenue for DNR to take on the non-point source side of things, they haven't really been as involved in that portion of implementing the strategy.
That's what creates one of the kind of the ironies and the asymmetries in how this works, in that because point sources are regulated in the Clean Water Act and can be required to have permits, then you have a direct regulatory authority and a requirement that people take action and in fact spend money. Whereas you don't have that same structure in a non-point or an agricultural situation. So you could go out into the countryside and be putting up a home and be putting in a new septic tank and be faced with spending extensive funds to meet the county's water quality and sanitation rules on your septic tank. But you could have a livestock facility go in across the road, and depending on its size, not be faced with anything similar in terms of the waste handling or the waste disposal practices, even though the size of the manure load created is wildly different. And I think that's an unfortunate distinction. And so as a result, you have any number of small towns in Iowa, right, that are faced with what could be significant costs to deal with water quality issues, who feel kind of put upon in terms of what they may be expected to bear, as opposed to what else they may see happening in their watershed. And in fact, the impacts of what their contribution to the pollution in the watershed may be relatively de minimis.
So we're getting a lot of really great audience questions. So I'm going to make a little bit more time at the end to answer some of them. So I want to ask you guys one final question before I turn over to those. What do you see as the future for the nutrient reduction strategy, and what would be the road to get there? Like any changes you think you would make, and how, if there's any political appetite to do so?
Well, I don't know that there's much political appetite to do so, but I think that we could use a nutrient reduction strategy 2.0 that put a similar amount of time and effort into the strategy part as to identifying priorities and how we're going to use the funds and establishing some type of minimum expected standards of stewardship. As it is now, right, we essentially endorse the moral hazard of what goes off of my water onto you is your problem. And the water that's being polluted is the public's water. It's Iowans' water. And so in many ways, it really is promoting immoral behavior. And so that's what I would hope, is that at some point we'll recognize that we need to, in fact, pick up the pace and try a few different tools.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's not really any political appetite to change or update the nutrient reduction strategy. We have put out a number of recommendations for how the strategy could be improved to actually turn it into a real strategy that includes things like benchmarks and regular analysis and updates. Currently, the strategy doesn't have those mechanisms within it. So, coming up on this 10 years, we've asked DNR and IDALS and ISU to take a 10-year review of the nutrient reduction strategy to say, okay, what's been going well, what's not been going so well, what should be the priorities, how should we change the policy language, and do some of that reframing, because you can't have a strategy without regularly analyzing how well it's working. So that would be the first thing, is just to do another review of it to say, let's update it. We also think that there are some practices that should be universally adopted across the state, like riparian buffers. You shouldn't be farming right up to the edge of a stream. That's just kind of a basic no-brainer, but currently you're allowed to do so. Minnesota has a buffer law currently that's been adopted at, I think, 98 or 99% compliance. And so these things are not out of the realm of possibility, but those are definitely the political challenges to get over the finish line. I think that, another thing that we could consider is reframing the perspective of the nutrient reduction strategy. Right now, it's all framed in the perspective of production is the highest and best use of Iowa lands, and it is to be preserved entirely. And so anything that's coming out of the nutrient reduction strategy is framed under that context. And instead, why can't we be thinking more about, what is better for all of Iowa and all of Iowa's citizens? Not necessarily just preserving that one thing, but creating opportunities for people to get outside and enjoy their waterways and feel safe drinking from their private well. So I think like a general reframing of the nutrient reduction strategy could really maybe turn things around or just kind of change the attitudes and perspective with which we're approaching it.
Yeah, I think we've seen some interesting things happen in the last few years with understanding how infrastructure needs to change to help support changes. So that's something I'd like to see more of, in terms of small businesses around the state that help support things like getting cover crop seed to farmers and custom application, contractors that work with installing saturated buffers, bioreactors, and wetlands. We just don't have enough of those in Iowa to get to the number of those practices that we need to support installation of all of those. So we hit bottlenecks throughout the system. So I'd like to see more emphasis on that in helping to provide training and support to build those local businesses and help support the installation of those practices. So it'd be benefit to that local economy, to that business, and also benefit the farmer and water quality. So I think there's some exciting things happening there. Also, continued investment in more permanent watershed coordinators. It just takes people on the ground. So whether they're employed in WMAs or soil and water districts or through IDALs, those permanent coordinators are really the key, and we see that all around the state where a permanent coordinator or a coordinator has relationships for a number of years. You see that in conservation success on the landscape.
So turning over to audience questions, one that I think ties into what we were just talking about, kind of political appetite for changes. Someone asked, do you see Iowa's nutrient reduction strategy changing in the future due to potential pressures from southern states that are directly affected by what we have outletted into the watersheds? If so, is publicity a major factor in addressing these future changes?
Well, certainly, I think anyone who looks at the hypoxia situation and how it's impacted the Gulf fisheries might wonder why it is that Louisiana hasn't sued Iowa and perhaps other upstream states for what we've done to the river and to the water and to their businesses. It's not clear, perhaps, that litigation would have a great deal of success. And on the issue of, would publicity help much? I mean, one of the most important things I think that happened in the last decade in Iowa was the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit against the upstream drainage districts. And it was essentially, I think, the waterworks concern that no one else was willing to accept any responsibility for how the water was being polluted in the Raccoon. And the case from a legal standpoint didn't move forward because of the Iowa Supreme Court's decision that drainage districts don't have any authority to do anything other than drain. But politically, people didn't take, I think, a lesson from that litigation and say, oh my gosh, what can we be doing, right, in these upstream counties and watersheds to improve water quality? I think the lesson they took from it was, well, we better put the tile in now. And we should remind Des Moines how much we resent the fact that they blamed us for their water quality efforts. And so at least I don't think history has shown us that attention or concern to these issues has moved the needle. In fact, we have an awful lot of happy talk, people celebrating the achievements and how much we've done and how we're doing everything we can. But the actual proof on the ground and in the water doesn't necessarily support that.
Yeah, we get asked frequently, why doesn't Louisiana sue Iowa? And I think it's just a lack of political will on their part. And I think also, Louisiana faces a lot of challenges with their water in addition to nutrient pollution. So it's maybe not their top priority. So big cases like that, there's huge undertakings to take at the federal level. You'd basically have to sue EPA to say that they haven't been forcing Iowa to do enough to prevent nutrient pollution from entering the waterways that are heading to Louisiana. I think that there is, opportunities for pressure from the federal level. The EPA released a memo, the one that really pushed states to create nutrient reduction strategies in 2011, really focused on the adoption of numeric nutrient criteria. And that has been totally avoided by the state, even though really clear recommendations for those criteria were issued just 2 years ago. And so basically that would change the way that we're evaluating Iowa's waters to say we have this narrative standard that says if the waters look bad, they look yucky, they have stuff floating in them, then they're impaired. Instead, we would say this is a numeric limit that if we're exceeding this for phosphorus or exceeding this for nitrogen, that we would consider the waters impaired and we'd be able to take action by creating a plan to remediate the waters. So, putting that kind of regulation in place would be really beneficial for us as we're actually assessing the state of our waters and how we're going to address the pollution. But that is something that the state has just avoided doing for a long time, but would be really beneficial and is something that the EPA has asked states to do for the last decade. So we'll see if that pressure increases in any way going forward.
I appreciate Alicia bringing that up, because if there is one pressure point, the EPA could require the state to do much more, but hasn't. And I think that part of the political strategy and why the agriculture community has made so much noise about the waters of the US rule is in part to keep EPA on their back heels and distract them from actually moving forward with water quality activity. And I think it's in some ways surprising that the EPA has been as generous from a time and a forgiveness standpoint to Iowa. But
to keep kind of moving through the many questions that we have from the audience, I'm going to throw this one to you, Jamie, because I know you do a lot of outreach with Iowans. People are asking, what can the average citizen do to help with water quality? Because
Sure.
Obviously, we've been talking about the strategies at the state level, but yeah, at the local level, what can people do?
Yeah, I think no matter what, where you live, how large, if you have a city lot or hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, the same principles can be applied. Looking at slowing water down, helping it infiltrate into the soil so it's not running off, and making sure that water can be, there's growing roots year round in your soil. So things like rain gardens, capturing water from your roofs, things like that, can be done in the backyard. I think beyond, physical action, it's just staying informed. It's sharing your thoughts with your elected officials and participating in events where you can share your thoughts related to the strategy and other water quality related events. But no matter what, we all have a role that we can play. We can make sure that the areas that we manage personally are not contributing to the problem, making sure our fertilizer application in yards is appropriate and according to recommendations. It's a small part, but it is something. But I think being active and making sure that, their voices are heard in all of the processes are also very important.
Testing your own drinking water, I think, would be an
Yes.
important too if you're in a private well. And people should know that every county in the state has funds to do private well testing, money provided by the state. And if you haven't had your well tested and you have concerns or would be interested in knowing what's in it, you should contact your county public health department.
Absolutely.
Quick plug on that. I think that was our subject for yesterday's expert panel. So audience members, if you missed that, that will be available. The recording will be available by the end of the week. Another question from the audience. We've talked about how there has been like little to no progress made on nitrogen reduction. And an audience member asked, is there an effective approach to limit application of nitrogen fertilizer that's recommended by the science showing how much nitrogen can be taken up by the crop? Sorry, I kind of lost in that.
We talked about this when we all got together and discussed this earlier, and I'll talk about it. And I think Jamie and Alicia will as well. But, there's the maximum return to nitrogen formula, which is developed by Purdue and Iowa State and others. And it's the one practice that was common to all of the scenarios that were used to validate the nutrient reduction strategy. And it's a projection of the nitrogen that you would need to apply to get 99% of your crop goals. And in a typical year, Iowans apply about 30 pounds per acre more on average than the MRTN would require. And so it's hundreds of millions of pounds of nitrogen and tens of millions of dollars of money. And but yet you don't see anyone. I haven't seen the billboard or the public service announcement saying, make sure you put your nitrogen on or your fertilizer on at the MRTN rate. And that's certainly a place we could start.
Yeah, there has been, you might see it in different ways, like the 4 R's. So right place, time, rate, related to fertilizer application. So that's one campaign that has been shared throughout the state related to nitrogen and phosphorus application. But there is risk involved in under applying. And so I understand from a farmer's point of view why it may be challenging to calculate that maximum return to nitrogen rate and apply only that, because there is risk of yield loss if, say, they plan to split apply and apply some in season and don't get a chance to apply it. So there are many reasons, risk-related reasons, that they're not using that rate, which I understand, but we do need to do more to support using those rates and encouraging that.
But this is a classic example of internalizing the benefits and externalizing the cost, because the risk of over applying is that it goes into the water and then your city has to remove it, or it's in your well. And so as long as over applying nutrients are costless, other than what you may have paid out of your pocket, but from a risk standpoint, there's no liability for trying to clean them up, then that's in part why you have the situation we have.
I would also just add that, some states have adopted regulations on, limiting fall fertilizer application. I believe Maryland and Wisconsin and Nebraska have some restrictions when the water quality hits a certain level, that fertilizer application in the fall is regulated, is restricted. So, things like that are possibilities and something that our state could consider doing as well.
Jamie, you mentioned that, we could do more to decrease the over application of fertilizer for farmers. One audience member basically asked, he said, my view is that addressing motivation, attitudes, and behavior will do more to affect change than improving our knowledge of the content. So how can we better reach those, landowners and farmers that, haven't made the voluntary changes needed up to this point?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're all motivated a little bit differently or learn a bit differently. So, the first thing that I think we've done is a lot of field days and getting the information out. Ways that we can start getting into motivations is, working with farmer champions for certain practices or methods, and having that information shared from a neighbor or, from a trusted friend that's also a farmer. So having that be more of a peer-to-peer learning than an expert to farmer, for lack of a better term, about that particular practice. But I agree. I think more to that question was, where's the social science? And I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of understanding motivations and behavior change related to the strategy. We've done a lot of survey work and have done some listening sessions, and we're starting to peel more of that back. But I think there's more to do there in understanding what will create behavior change in a voluntary system.
I mean, one of the surprising reports that came out of Iowa State in the last year or so was the Rural Life poll about water quality. And it showed that 40% of farmers had either not heard of or were very unfamiliar with the nutrient reduction strategy. And given all the attention that we've given to it and everything that's been in the farm press and on the news, you have to wonder, where were those folks, right? I mean, how do you not know about this? And so the whole issue of, when we claim we're doing everything we can, well, some people are, but some people aren't even on the message yet.
Well, and I think that, that gets to the point of making it voluntary versus a requirement. So you can choose to ignore it, or, even, with the greatest incentives, we still see, a lack of implementation, with the Iowa watershed approach. The North Raccoon River Watershed Association had to return over $1 million because they could not find enough volunteers to take that money and put conservation practices in the ground. So even if we're trying to address those motivations and those behaviors through this voluntary way, we're not finding success. And so that's where the conversation turns to regulation and saying, nobody likes to be regulated. No one does, but every other major polluting industry in the world is regulated. And that's just something that they have to deal with because it's necessary.
Well, we are approaching the end of our session. In the last 2 minutes, panelists, do you all have any last words you want to impart on us?
I would say we know what needs to be done. Our actions aren't as smart as we are. And I think too many people have found ways to have excuses as to why we can't move forward. And, I think the sell-by date of the voluntary only approach is fast approaching.
So I would say, if you care about this issue, if you're feeling jaded by the whole conversation, as we often feel, please get involved. Please talk to your elected officials. Please become an advocate and talk to your neighbors. I think, it's really easy to feel discouraged and like we can't make an impact on these issues, but we really need people to be speaking out and to be, like Jamie said, staying informed. So that we can try to make change and push for improvements. It's not going to happen without public engagement and public sentiment.
Yeah, I encourage folks to take the opportunities you have to learn about the strategy. Encourage, farmer neighbors, if you're living in rural areas, ask about what they're doing, have civil conversations. I think to make change, we need to make it part of our culture. And those are the kind of actions that need to happen to say that water quality and conservation are things that we talk about in the state. They're things that are important to us. So no matter what your role is, where you live, city, rural area, farm, we need to talk about it and, keep gaining information through education and information sources about the strategy and about conservation and water quality.
Well, that is the end of our time. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in and for sending in such great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I hope this was insightful. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today. and sharing your time and expertise with us. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience does too. And thank you again to our Iowa Ideas sponsor, ITC Midwest, and our in-depth week sponsor, LaRue Law Firm, for your support. As a reminder to our audience, we have an expert panel tomorrow about emerging contaminants in drinking water, which I'll be hosting again. So come join us and ask some really good questions again. And then another reminder, the registration for the full Iowa Ideas Conference that's taking place this October and is free and virtual is now open at iowaideas.com. So thanks so much for joining and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Brittany.